What's going on, guys? Jacob here, and today we are talking about exercise selection for lower body hypertrophy. And in this video, I'm going to give you guys a basic overview of the anatomy for the lower body, the functions of each muscle group, and exercises that you can perform that will allow you to maximize growth of each muscle group. And I'm going to categorize them into priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3 movements in order of importance. So 1 being these should be the staple of your program, and priority 2 and 3 are optional but will be beneficial in allowing you to create a program that will maximize regional hypertrophy of that muscle group. And we're going to talk about some of the practical applications in program design, such as frequency, volume, and the rep ranges and loading zones that these exercises are going to lend themselves best to. I'm also going to give you guys some key takeaways for each muscle group so that you can train them effectively, and just some tidbits that I've learned through my years in the gym. So first, let's talk about the quads. There are 4 components of the quad: the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, the vastus intermedius, and the vastus medialis. So the functions of the quad are twofold. Number 1, the distal fibers are responsible for knee extension, and we have the proximal fibers, which are closer to the hip. They're responsible for hip flexion, such as a squat. That's going to be training both hip flexion and knee extension, whereas a leg extension would only train knee extension. So some priority 1 exercises. You guys should be familiar with this, but any squat variation, whether it's high bar, low bar, or front squat, again, there's a lot of discussion around which one is best for quad hypertrophy. They all can be useful. They're tools to build your quads, and neither is necessarily better or worse. It's going to come down to your personal preference, your leverages and segment lengths, and which one will allow you to effectively train the quads with a sufficient amount of stimulus. So simply picking one and looking to get better at that over time is really important. And other priority 1 movements are leg press and hack squats. Priority 2 exercise, I like to think of these movements as being supplementary to those exercises. And they're unilateral movements for the most part. So any lunge variation, Bulgarian split squat, whilst I'll train all the muscle groups in your lower body, they can be a great addition if you're trying to build your quads, because you can get more volume and exposure to tension without as much systemic fatigue, because we know those big compound movements and multi-joint exercises such as squats, leg press, and hack squats, we can use quite a significant amount of load, and this can cause a lot of fatigue. So there's only so much volume we can get there without overreaching. So yeah, lunge variations are your priority 2 exercises, and priority 3 is your leg extensions. So again, leg extension is really useful in accruing additional volume that's not as fatiguing through just knee extension, and shouldn't be discounted as any less important than those P2 and P1 exercises. However, it's really a case of if you have the time to dedicate towards training for long durations, we can obviously have a little more variation in our exercise selection. And if you are someone who's quite time poor, then you need to prioritize those P1 and P2 movements, simply because you're going to get more bang for your buck. When it comes to volume for the quads, typically anywhere between 10 to 18 sets per week is going to be where most people will see a good response in their leg development. Picking 1 to 2 priority 1 movements, so you might have squats on one day and a hack squat on another day, and again 1 to 2 P2 movements, and incorporating your knee extensions if you have time once or twice a week is really useful. But 3 to 4 exercises in total within a mesocycle, and just remember, too much variation can be detrimental as you're just going to have to relearn motor patterns over and over again. So within a mesocycle, you probably want to have 3 to 4 max so that you can become proficient at these lifts and then start overloading them and creating that tension that we need to build muscle. When it comes to loading zones, a lot of common sense should dictate, but 5 to 10 reps for those multi-joint exercises. Simply trying to perform more than 10 reps on a squat is only going to lead to technical breakdown and potential compensatory movements and other muscle groups assisting too much, which again isn't ideal or optimal. And again, this is very much the same for those P2 and P3 movements. We want to be working them with 10 to 30 reps for the most part, simply because they're self-selecting towards those rep ranges. You need to consider the risk of injury as well with those multi-joint free weight exercises, and just the fact that fatigue of supporting muscles could be a limiting factor. So this is again where your leg extensions really can be a useful way to build your quads, because we know for certain that the quads are working and there's no confounding variables there. Again, this is where you need to consider whether or not low rep leg extensions is going to be useful. It's probably not. So high rep squats, not a good idea. Low rep leg extensions, not a good idea. So just common sense there, guys. And just make sure that you're monitoring your response to your program. So if you're somebody who's relatively fast twitch dominant, you're going to respond pretty well to those lower end rep ranges. But most people will be in the middle, and they're going to get some pretty good gains with a broad spectrum of reps. But if you are someone who's a little more slow twitch dominant, working towards a higher end of those rep ranges is where you could see some better progress. Some important training tips when you're training the quads: just remember, use as full a range of motion as possible, depending on your orthopedic profile. So that is, just how you put together your segment lengths, the structure of your joints, especially the hip if you're performing squat variations, and yeah, ankle mobility as well. But also take into account you need to have strength and control through that range. So it's no point squatting ass to grass if you're losing a hell of a lot of tension and you're just going to blow your back. But again, what I want you guys to also consider when you're training your quads is the technical components to those free weight multi-joint exercises such as your squats, because they do take some time to master. And if you're still practicing the squat, learning the movement pattern, and you just can't load it up and provide a sufficient training stimulus with your squats, you want to bias your volume and your intensity to those less skill demanding exercises, such as your leg press, your hack squats, leg extensions, and potentially those lunge variations. So just take that into consideration as well, guys. Now let's talk about the hamstrings. So hamstrings have essentially 3 components: the biceps femoris, which is broken down into long and the short head, the semitendinosus, and the semimembranosus. Now, functions of the hamstring: flexion of the knee, which the distal fibers, so furthest away from the hip, are going to do most of the work for. So think of your hamstring curls, and then you have your proximal fibers working through hip extension. So they're the primary 2 movements, but don't forget that hamstrings also help assist in external and internal rotation. Your priority 1 movements are going to be your Romanian deadlifts and your stiff-legged deadlifts for the most part, and good mornings. So the reason this is simply because they're going to provide the most amount of tension through both concentric and eccentric actions. If you're performing a typical conventional deadlift or sumo deadlift, there's going to be a significant portion of the quads being involved in the execution of the rep, which simply takes away from the amount of tension placed on the hamstrings, and the fact that these lifts in a powerlifting style are typically only training a concentric action. You're just missing out a lot of tension there. So anything that allows for both eccentric and concentric loading of the hamstrings is going to be far superior for muscle growth than those typical deadlift variations that we see people perform. Priority 2 exercises, there's only one here, a glute hamstring raise. Fantastic movement, training both knee flexion and hip extension, but the reason it's a priority 2 movement is that it takes some time to master. You need a sufficient base of posterior chain strength to be able to perform that in the first place, and many of you might not even have access to that equipment, so again, it's not a priority 1. And priority 3, similar to the leg extension situation, is your leg curls. So don't discount leg curls just because they're priority 3. It's just, again, a time consideration. If you don't have a lot of time and you're performing your good mornings, your Romanian deadlifts, stiff leg deadlifts, you can build some serious wheels. But if you do have the luxury of more time, getting in some hamstring curls is going to be a great idea. When it comes to training your hamstrings and program design, 2 to 3 times a week for the most part. In my experience, twice a week is more than sufficient. Typically, people just fatigue or feel soreness and tightness in the hamstrings a little longer, and they take a while to recover because they're more fast twitch dominant for the most part. But again, we need to consider that the more advanced you become, the more disruption to homeostasis and the more stress you can apply to the muscle. So if you're somebody who's using some big loads on those stiff leg deadlifts, Romanian deadlifts, you probably only want to train your hamstrings twice a week. But if you're somebody who's still learning how to engage the hamstrings and feel them in a deep stretch and get that stimulus there, not the lower back, then 3 times a week could be where you see some great results. Volume for the hamstrings is a little less than the quads, again because they do fatigue a little quicker. So 10 to 16 sets, anywhere within that range, and assessing how you respond is going to be a good starting point. Picking one priority, one movement within a mesocycle, and optional P2. And if you can, getting your leg curls and that P3 movement in is going to be really useful. And the loading zones for the hamstrings, as I said, they can produce more force. They're typically type 2 dominant, so 5 to 8 reps for your P1 movements, your stiff leg and your Romanian deadlifts, because any higher than that and the lower back can start to fatigue, and you get some serious pumps in your erectors, which could be detrimental to your health and longevity. So consider the joint risk and the compensation of other muscle groups in those movements. But anywhere from 5 to 8 reps is going to make sense, and 8 to 15 reps for your P2 and your P3s, so your glute ham raises and your hamstring curls, usually within that range, and most people will see some decent development. Some training tips on the hamstrings. People have tight hamstrings simply because they're sitting down in flexion and they just don't have the awareness of their posterior chain, which can be really detrimental in their ability to load the hamstrings. So make sure that you have some mobility through your hamstrings, and that you're not training through a range of motion that sees you compensate at the lower back, or you just get pain when you get into that position. And also, make sure that you are trying to feel your hamstrings. When you're performing your stiff leg deadlifts and your Romanian deadlifts. In your hamstring curls, big tip for you guys is to keep your hips silent, so no excessive arching of the lower back, because we want to recruit those distal fibers of the hamstring and make sure that we're putting all that tension on those knee flexors. When it comes to the glutes, most people don't need to train their glutes directly if they're doing their quad and hamstring training, as I outlined previously. However, if you're someone who wants to really maximize your glute development, or perhaps you're simply struggling to feel your hips or be able to control your pelvis, so what is known as lumbar pelvic control, training the glutes directly can be a really useful strategy. It's also something I recommend if you're unable to train those squats and deadlift variations really hard because you're injured, because the axial loading in those movements can cause quite a lot of pain and discomfort if you're someone who has lower back injuries. And this is where movements like hip thrusts and training the glutes directly can really help you strengthen that centerpiece of the body and improve your lifting in those other muscle groups. But remember, the glutes are broken down into two components. We've got the upper fibers, which is the majority of the fibers, and the lower fibers. And they're responsible for four things, which is extension of the hips, external rotation, abduction, and adduction. So the glutes do quite a bit. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of indirect stimulus via those hip dominant movements. So we may not need to train them necessarily directly, but if you do want to prioritize glute development, any deadlift variation is going to really fire up the glutes, potentially using deficits or conventionals or sumos. Even though I did recommend that they're probably not movements we want to be training for hypertrophy, these will target the glutes a little more, really hit the glutes hard. Your barbell hip thrusts and your glute bridges also going to be great priority 1 movements. Priority 2 exercises, a reverse hyper, great exercise that can really target the glutes if you're performing it with a little bit of thoracic flexion and just getting some hip extension there. Glute ham raises again, so you can see there's a lot of carryover from your hamstring training to the glute training, which is why training the glutes directly isn't necessarily something everybody needs to do, but worth mentioning when we talk about lower body. And finally, those priority 3 movements are going to be anything that trains external rotation and adduction. So yeah, making sure that you're doing some clams or some machine adduction work is going to really help for completeness. Frequency for the glutes, 2 to 3 times a week. Again, it's going to depend on the type of exercises you select. So if you're performing low load, high rep glute exercises, such as your abduction, external rotation work, or anything with bands, you probably train your glutes a little more frequently. Where if you're using those priority 1 exercises where there's going to be greater tension stimulus or magnitude of tension, you may need to train your glutes directly a little less frequently. And loading zones, broad spectrum of reps, really works well for the glutes. Train them heavy, train them light, train them moderate. But do consider high rep deadlifts, not a good idea, and low rep abduction work is pretty silly. So common sense again, and just remembering that some exercises are self-selecting to certain rep ranges. But some big training tips: just learn to control your pelvis and minimize overextending your lumbar or the position of your ribs. So just being able to control the different segments of your spine as you learn to flex and extend your hips is going to be really useful for being able to build a big peach. And again, using bands can be a great way to just increase activation and knowing where your glutes are. I think if you can activate your glutes, it's going to have a huge amount of transfer into your squats, your deadlifts, and you may eventually get to a point where you don't need to train your glutes directly because they're doing their job when you're training those big compound lifts. Finally, onto the last muscle group, which a lot of you folk neglect and probably shouldn't, is the calves, which are made up of the gastrocnemius and the soleus. So the gastrocnemius has medial and lateral head, meaning medial inside towards the midline and lateral further away from the midline, which is responsible for plantar flexion, so getting up on your toes, and knee flexion. So also when you're doing those hamstring curls and you're in dorsiflexion, your calves are going to be doing a little bit of work. And your soleus is responsible for plantar flexion also. So only P1 exercises for the calves, calf raise machine on a leg press or a hack squat, Smith machine, stairs with a dumbbell, or seated machines, or seated with a dumbbell. Picking 1 to 2 of these to be in part of your program. Again, remember that the more variation you have, the longer it's going to take you to learn and become proficient at contracting your calves with that specific exercise. So keep the variation low, but train them quite frequently because the calves are a slow twitch dominant muscle group, and they will respond well to higher rep ranges with moderate loads. And just getting in, a greater frequency of work can always help lead to some bigger baby moo-moos. But yeah, as I mentioned, 10 to 30 reps, because those lighter reps is where most people will see or feel at least the calves doing some serious work. lower than 10 reps, and you're probably not getting sufficient durations of tension that's going to fire up the calves, simply because they are so slow twitch dominant. But a big training tip when you're working the calves is not to bounce and flop around like this. You want to make sure that you're controlling your eccentric and your isometrics to take out the stretch reflex of the Achilles tendon. So, coming up on your tippy toes in plantar flexion, nice big pause at the top, slowly coming down into dorsiflexion, pausing for a second or two, and then coming back up. So tempo work is really useful for the calves. So guys, I hope this video was useful. I hope you found it informative. If you did, make sure you like it, subscribe to the channel, and I'll speak to you all next time.